Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our online lecture looking at the process of photosynthesis. So at this point, we've talked a little bit about the idea of adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, and how it's structured, and we've talked about the overview of photosynthesis. So you should have seen a diagram that looks like the one on the screen currently. It's showing a brief summary of the two major parts of photosynthesis. So first we have our light-dependent reactions, where you'll notice this is the point where the light is coming in to the system. And then we have our light-independent reactions. These reactions occur based on the products of the light-dependent reactions, but doesn't actively use light. So as long as the inputs are there, the light-independent reactions can happen in the dark. Our goal today is that we can give a little bit more detail as to what's going on within each of the reaction sets and understand where the parts of the photosynthesis chemical reaction are actually involved in the process. Notice that these compounds in the middle are very important and get used and kind of recycled through the system, but they aren't actually a part of the chemical reaction because they just get recycled. The chemical reaction will represent the forms of matter that are being changed during the process. So first we're going to take a look at the light-dependent reactions. Now this, I know initially looks a little intimidating, but it's really going to focus on the matter and the electrons. So coming in down here at the bottom, you'll notice this is where the water molecules are involved. When the light comes in and hits that first photosystem, which is photosystem 2, electrons are kicked out along this pathway. In order for the system to work, we have to replace the electrons that get kicked out, and water is the source of those electrons. When water is broken apart by enzymes, remember, those are those proteins that can help a reaction happen. Then you're going to have the electrons go into the system and replace the ones that were lost. Left over then, we're going to have H+ ions. And then O2 is going to be our byproduct that we no longer need. So very early in the process, we see the release of the oxygen as a byproduct. So during the light-dependent reactions, we have water in and we have O2 out. And that water is coming, or the oxygen is coming from the breaking apart of water. It's a leftover, it's a byproduct, meaning we don't need it anymore, or at least the plant doesn't. Now the importance of those electrons is when the light hits the photosystem, it energizes them. So then as they move through the system, think of that almost like electricity or flowing energy. They give up a little bit of that energy to make some ATP as a part of this process. And then a second photosystem, photosystem 1, it was found first even though it comes second in the line, is going to energize those electrons again, and they get captured by NADP+. This is our electron carrier. The job of this molecule is simply to move electrons to where they need to go. So the form that carries the electrons is NADPH. You'll notice that there's a little bit of a difference there. No electrons, we've got a plus sign there. With the electrons, it's now neutral because I've canceled out that charge by picking up the electrons. So the purpose here, we're going to get to that in the next slide, sorry. The purpose here is really to convert light energy to chemical energy. By adjusting the position of those electrons and moving them to a molecule, those high energy electrons are now stored in a compound. That's a different form of energy than light energy. Too far. So let's think about where this is happening. That process was occurring along the thylakoid membranes. You'll remember that those membranes surround the thylakoids and they are in pancake-like stacks. Those stacks have high surface area, meaning more space for these reactions to occur. We put in light, that was a form of energy. We put in water, which is a form of matter. And technically, we had to put in our NADP plus and some ADP and P. So that phosphate group that's going to get tacked on to create the ATP has to be present in order for this to work. We get out of it O2, which is a form of matter. We get out our H, which is carrying some energy. And we get out our ATP, which is also a form of energy, that is matter. Now the things that get recycled, our ATP is part of that recycling process with the ADP and P. And our NADPH is a molecule that gets recycled between the NADP plus form. So the red things are things that get recycled through the process, whereas the things in black come in or go out totally. Now the main purpose of this process is to capture the light energy and convert to chemical energy. This happens when the light is absorbed and when the electrons are energized. So the transfer of those electrons to the NADPH is now putting that energy in a chemical form. Trick is, we don't yet have a food material that's able to be used by living things very easily. We still need to do the step of creating the sugars. That's where the light-independent reactions come in. So here we see the CO2 input. And we're going to need several molecules of CO2, 6 in fact, to make this process work. Within the stroma, again, there are enzymes that complete each of these steps. They facilitate the reactions. And the CO2 molecules are going to get tacked on to other carbon-based molecules. Notice the black circle. That means that carbon is in these molecules. Big picture, everything that happens along this pathway is a series of chemical reactions that changes the shape of these carbon-based compounds a little bit. Every change in shape can rearrange the molecule until we can get to a product that we need and can use. So to do those types of reactions, we have to spend some energy. That's why we made it in the first set of reactions, because that ATP, that energy source, can now be used to complete these reactions that the enzymes help with. In that process, we see the electrons transferred to these molecules. The addition of the electrons and the CO2 is what allows us to create these sugars that are released. So most of the carbon-based compounds get recycled through the system. Things go on, things get rearranged, and then things get broken off. The sugars that we can actually use as an output get broken off in that process. So let's summarize what we have coming out and what we have going in. So the light independent reactions happen in the stroma. Remember, that's the fluid-filled section around the thylakoids. I'm putting in CO2, and I'm bringing the electrons with the NADPH. And I'm bringing in energy with the ATP. I'm getting out my sugar compounds, and I get back the NADP plus and ADP plus P forms of the molecules. Again, NADP plus and NADPH are in that recycling process, as well as the ADP plus P and ATP. The purpose of this part is the actual production of the food. Carbohydrates, if you recall, are high energy because they are complex. CO2 is much simpler and has fewer bonds than C6H12O6, which is a common sugar, glucose, that is created in this process. So when I put the CO2s together with those high energy electrons, I now have a larger, more complex molecule that is at a higher energy level. So that energy can then be broken down and used in cell respiration. So photosynthesis is to make the food, and then that food source becomes available to all living things, including the herbivores and other organisms that eat them as a food source. That energy then can be transferred on to the carnivores who eat the herbivores who eat the plants. But without plants to make that initial conversion of energy, there'd be no way for us heterotrophs to be able to access it. So one thing that's always pretty amazing to me is that photosynthesis is a process that is able to create complex forms of matter from a gas, CO2, that we can't even see, taste, or smell, and water, which is a pretty simple thing that really doesn't provide us any energy. That is a pretty impressive feat for plants to be able to do. You may notice that this video goes along with the modeling activity worksheet that you got in class. I would encourage you to go back and take a look at this if you haven't already, and use the video to fill out your modeling and your chart that's on the back. If you have any questions, make sure you ask or contact me for further explanation.